All right, well, good morning. Chair Shelley Bailey, call the Prescription Drug Affordability Meeting on July 24th, 2024 to order. Steve, if you could please call the roll.
Will do. Chair Shelley Bailey.
Here.
Vice Chair Amy Burns.
Here.
Dan Hartung.
Present.
Robert Judge.
Here.
Chris Lehman.
Here.
John Murray, who's excused. Akil Patterson. And Dan Kennedy.
Here. Here.
Chair, we have a quorum.
Thank you, Steve. So I would like to ask any board members present here if you have any declarations of real or perceived conflict of interest.
No.
Mr. Robert Judge, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. I want to acknowledge that my professional background and current employment may create the appearance of a conflict of interest. I'm committed to the highest ethical standards and will recuse myself from any discussion or decision where a conflict arises. I'll disclose any potential conflicts to the board in advance.
Thank you, Mr. Robert Judge. All right, so I would like to ask if any board members here today have any changes to the draft minutes from June 26, 2024. All right, well then I would like to call to see if anyone will motion and a second to approve the minutes.
This is Dan Kennedy. I move for approval of the minutes.
Thank you, Dan. Do we have a second?
I second.
Thank you, Mr. Robert Judge. Steve, can you please call the roll?
Will do. I'm back. Chair Shelley Bailey.
I approve the minutes.
Vice Chair Amy Burns.
Aye.
Dan Hartung.
Aye.
Robert Judge.
Aye.
Chris Lehman.
Aye.
Dan Kennedy.
Aye.
Minutes are approved.
Thank you, Steve. So I'd now like to call on our Program Executive Director, Ralph Magrish, to provide a program update.
And thank you, Chair Bailey. Just make sure everybody's hearing me okay.
Yep.
Yeah.
Great. Thank you so much. And I will be brief. First this morning, I want to welcome Pei Chen Chu to our team. Pei is our new research analyst who started on Monday. Last month, I introduced Heather Doyle as our new data analyst, and we are extremely excited that our research and data team is fully staffed for the first time in more than 6 months. So we are ready and poised to support the board as we go forward with resetting affordability reviews. Welcome, Pei, if you're on camera. And next up, to speak to the recruitment, we did close the recruitment for the one upcoming board vacancy. We have forwarded a recommendation to the governor's office for the September round of appointments, and we anticipate and hope that that process will go well and that this new individual will be joining us in September. This is the seat that will be vacated by Akil Patterson. Also very pleased to share with you that both Vice Chair Amy Burns and Member John Murray have sought reappointment as their current terms do expire the end of December. We'll also note that, as I mentioned last month, that I am sitting on Representative Levy's Patient Assistance Program Work Group. That group did meet yesterday, and we'll share my takeaway from that for the board to contemplate as it moves forward in the coming months in our conversations around affordability and defining it. Knowing our charges to identify drugs that may create affordability challenges for the healthcare system or high out-of-pocket costs for patients. I think part of our future discussion is that in the currently dysfunctional healthcare system and marketplace, is it possible for drugs to actually be both affordable to the healthcare system and to patients? And if so, what does that need to look like in terms of a functional versus dysfunctional system? Are these issues of benefit design, list price, PBM cost, rebates, plan sponsors, or federal regulations for that matter? So all things for the board to consider going forward. And then finally, I just want to take a pause for a quick moment and say that for folks dealing with wildfires and smoke around our state, we collectively as staff and the board wish the very best to you. We know this is a very difficult time for many people in our state. Contextually, for folks around the country that are tuned in today, we have 38 wildfires currently burning in our state, covering more than 767,000 acres. There are currently 4 mega fires in our state, each covering more than 100,000 acres. Contextually, folks, that is, each of those is larger than the city of Portland itself. And we'll also say that we do have a board member, John Murray, who is impacted by these fires and is that for that reason not with us today. So we send John our support and to him and his entire community. Thank you, Chair Bailey. End of report.
Ralph, thank you very much for your update. So to kick off today's meeting, I would like to share the board is hosting 7 constituent panels today. This is a follow-up to the focus groups and community forums that the board has held recently to hear feedback about upper payment limits. An upper payment limit, or UPL, limits what purchasers in Oregon will pay for specific drugs. I also personally wish to thank everyone here today and those not here who did attend these constituent sessions to provide us with meaningful impact related to the UPL. So again, thank you for those participating today as well as those who participated in previous sessions. So moving forward, this will be a question and answer format moderated by myself as board chair. I will begin each panel with a brief introduction of the panel members, followed by board questions. Only individuals invited into a panel are to participate. Panelists, please turn your cameras on with mics muted when I announce your assigned panel. Let's see. If you would like to answer a question, then raise your hand using the raise your hand function in Zoom. And when I call on you, please unmute your mic and state your name and organization before you answer the question. To ensure that we receive meaningful comments and provide opportunities for all panelists to participate, please keep your answers brief and in alignment with the specific question that's being asked. If you have additional comments or feedback for the board that we were not able to discuss today, please make sure that you provide this as written comment through the PDAB website, and the board will review the feedback provided. If the board didn't get to your answer, please provide the written comment again through our website. So again, once your panel is complete, please turn off your cameras and microphones. And again, I wish to thank everyone here today for your participation. So our first panel today is related to patients and consumers. So I would like to announce the start of this panel and reference that we did have one individual who wished to participate in the panel today, and that individual is named Mr. Mark Sturbois. So Mr. Sturbois, if you are here today and you would like to provide information to the board related to the patient or consumer perspective related to how a UPL may impact you, you do have the floor and you have 5 minutes to provide such feedback.
Okay. I hope you can hear me okay.
We can.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. Thank you for being here.
Okay. I'm glad to be here. I for years have advocated for healthcare reform in many different forums, and right now I'm actually terminally ill with untreatable, uncurable cancer. I wasn't supposed to be alive I was supposed to be dead by last Christmas, and I'm still going strong. So I really need to make sure that we can keep on doing research and development because that's my only lifeline I have right now. But I was a little I had several things that are related to the consumer side, and I'm not sure they're with your instructions that they're germane right now. But so if I start off something and it's off topic, please let me know. One thing that people don't talk about is that there's a board that it's a private board that sets the reimbursement rates for Medicare and Medicaid payments. Now, this year, they decided that the the reimbursement rate was going to be either 3.4 or 3.6%. However, the estimates say that it's the actual increase in cost to hospitals and providers is going to be roughly 4%. What happens when they do this, and large areas can generally make up that difference, but you have an awful lot of rural providers that no longer accept Medicare patients, and that definitely affects the consumers. They're going to have to drive miles and miles to get their to find a provider that will even treat them. Then you have hospitals, or you have hospitals and insurance companies using dummy corporations to buy out small clinics and then put them under their network. Which once again, if you have an unchecked prescription benefit manager, drives that cost up. Those are things that when I look at the statute of the two Senate bills that establish this, they're not really mentioned, but they're very germane to the cost of prescription drugs to the consumer.
Mr. Sturboy,
And
thank you very much.
say again.
I just want to let you know that your time is almost up as we proceed through these panels. I did want to also mention that I've had the personal opportunity to meet you and really want to thank you for the public testimony today, as well as in some of our consumer sessions. So if you have any parting comment, I did want to make sure to allow you that, but then we'll proceed to our next panel.
All right. Well, I can just say we really need to decentivize the some of the perks for the prescription benefit managers, because it not only when you go to preferred and non-preferred drugs and things that can change from year to year, somebody on a fixed income, that's killing them. They decide, well, maybe I don't need this drug as much as I do, and we've got to put a stop to that.
Well, thank you. Again, thank you for your testimony here today. And again, I really want to thank you for taking the time to participate throughout this journey. So we will make sure.
Okay, I wish I was a little better prepared.
You're great. And again, you and I've met before, and this is very meaningful to have today here with all of our colleagues. So thank you again.
Well, you're very welcome.
Thanks. So let's see. Now we are moving
Chair
on.
Bailey, if I could ask to recognize Robert Judge. I'm sorry. Thank you.
I'm sorry, Robert. I missed your hand.
Yeah, no worries. Thank you, Chair Bailey. And I want to just ask this question, and thank you very much for your testimony, because our mission is really to identify the impact of prescription drug costs on consumers as well as payers, and actions that can be taken to help ameliorate that. So my question is very specific, and hopefully you can give us some insight on this. But actually, there's two questions I want to ask, and I'll ask them together. Have you ever? I understand you're dealing with a terminal condition. I'm sorry to hear that. But in the course of your therapy, have you ever skipped filling a prescription or rationed medication because of the cost to you? That's part A. And part B, if you look at your cost burden for your medications, how has that out-of-pocket obligation for the medications affected your household budget? I'm trying to get to kind of the impact to consumers, and you're the consumer patient representative. I want to kind of hear your voice on this.
Well, for myself, I have pretty good insurance. Plus, I get Medicare. I have a small pension, and as long as I'm on my disability insurance, I've been able to cover things. But in the past, when I wasn't making the money that I was making, when I was just getting cured for the hepatitis C, I mean, my Harvoni drugs were $800 to $900 a pill for 12 weeks.
Yeah.
And the second part of your question, Robert, I just want to be mindful of our panelists' time for our next panel.
Yeah. Well, it impacted me when I was getting the treatment, because even though the government covered the price of the pills, I was having both my specialist and my regular doctor ordering the same test, and each test cost a couple $100 because they weren't talking to each other.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know if that answers your question, but hopefully it did.
Well, I think your Harvoni example was informative for sure. Well,
Sure,
historical.
you get the entire treatment for $900 over in India.
Yeah, get it.
The price of one pill.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Much for the question. And again, Mr. Sturbois, thank you so much for your participation today.
As long as I'm alive, I'll answer whatever questions you need.
It helps us greatly. Again, thank you very much. So our next
You're
panel,
welcome.
thank you, is our Pharmacy Benefit Manager panel. And the attendees on this panel are Greg Baker, CEO and BS of Pharmacy for Affirmed RX, Tonaya Sorrell Neal, Senior Director of State Affairs at PCMA, and Eugenia Mendez Harper, State Government Affairs Principal at Prime Therapeutics. So for everyone here today, if you can please make sure your cameras are on and your microphone is on. Again, we have 15 minutes for this panel, so we do appreciate brevity in responses to allow time for board members to ask questions of the panelists. So keeping in mind that, or let's see, Steve, can we confirm that all three panelists are here and available?
I can confirm that for you, Chair Bailey. They are. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you for the confirmation. So keeping in mind that the board's ultimate goal here is to improve drug affordability for Oregonians, I think that the first question that I'd like to present to the panelists here today is that numerous constituents have suggested that pass-through models whereby UPL savings are ultimately realized at the point of sale could help improve affordability for patients. The board understands that at least one state, which is the state of West Virginia, has adopted such a model. So if Oregon were to pursue such a model, what data or reporting would PBMs be able to provide to demonstrate 100% pass-through of the UPL savings for an insured patient? So before I start selecting panelists, if anyone would prefer to raise their hand to help start off by answering this question, I would greatly appreciate it. Okay, Greg, I see your hand is raised first. Thank you for your participation.
Yep, thank you, Chair Bailey. What I would say is, yes, especially in the PBM industry, with the backdrop of yesterday, the House Oversight and Accountability Committee in Washington, D.C. held almost a 5-hour hearing with the top 3 executives of the 3 largest PBMs. I think this is incredibly timely. I think it's special that you and your committee here are really looking out for the best interest of all Oregonians. And transparency to us is really at the center of all of these conversations. I think where you can continue to make sure that whoever that decision maker is on what drugs Oregonians are allowed to get. And again, PBMs in general are the ones saying, doctor, you can prescribe drug A. We're not going to allow you to prescribe drug B. And drug A has a certain cost and back-end financial ramifications for rebates and manufacturer revenues as acquired by affiliated entities to these PBMs, really drive the decision-making process.
Now,
So from our standpoint, what I would, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
okay, I just want to make sure we're on topic related to the pass-through model that we've seen in West Virginia. And
Yeah,
how
no. So from the pass-through model, the big thing to the direct crux of your question is what data do you need from a PBM to ensure that, you know, Oregonians are getting the right cost at the lowest possible price point? And it's a complex question because CVS, for example, no longer is a PBM, Caremark, that gets rebates directly from manufacturers because they've created Zinc, which is considered a group purchasing organization, as they call it. Zinc gets the revenue from manufacturers. Zinc then passes whatever revenue they want to CVS, Caremark, the PBM. Then the PBM itself passes whatever, either at a point of sale or other, to the ultimate payer or the patient. So if any law or regulation is written that says, PBM, you have to provide me all your data, it's missing all of the other financials that go through affiliated owned entities to the great organization that CVS is also party to. And you miss the ability to capture all of the financial benefits that Oregonians should be getting.
well, thank you for that information. So I guess if we had a perfect world where we were getting that type of data direct from the PBM, keeping in mind that we may have to look broader than just directly from the PBM, do you have, and I do want to give time to the other speakers with their hand raised, but do you have a few short lists of data requirements that we could all learn from today that would be helpful in the board when we, you know, might solicit such information? Do you have a few suggestions, or I can ask the next speaker if you'd prefer?
Yeah, no, Chair Bailey, I'll keep it very short. I would make sure that the PBM, through all affiliated entities, shares all manufacturer revenue in all forms with you. So it is really just all forms. If it says rebate, that's a contractual game and they're keeping a lot of fees. And they'll say, I'll pass you 99% of rebates, but there's a significant amount of manufacturer revenue not being accounted for in those statements. So all manufacturer revenue.
Thank you very much for that suggestion related to the data. Ms. Mendez Harper, I believe you had your hand up next. Do you have any insights related to how pass-throughs might work? For example, the arrangement that West Virginia has?
So my understanding of the question was, what data or reporting would PBMs be able to provide to ensure, you know, robust, you know, comprehensive reporting? And I just wanted to remind folks or just let folks know that the PBM industry worked with Executive Director Magrish and other PDAB folks on a bill during this last legislative session where we are required, well, we are required to report to the Oregon DCBS key information about rebates and pass through, and we modeled it after the legislation that's been passed in Texas. And what we have to report is all of the rebates that we receive, then which of those rebates that are received, what percentage are retained as part of our compensation for the services we provide. Also, the percentage of rebates that are passed on at the point of sale, which means at the pharmacy counter directly to the patient, and then the amount of those rebates that are passed back to the payers or clients that hire us as PBMs. So I just wanted to let you know that that information is something that will be reported in, and I think gets to the questions of looking at what's being reported and how to segment those out by point of sale rebates, pass through, and things of that nature. So I think that once we start to see that reporting come through, that will be helpful in addressing your question.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the additional context related to that. Ms. Tanaya Neal, I believe you had your hand up next.
And it's Tanya, just for
Tanya,
ease.
thank you. Thank you.
So I represent PCMA, and we recognize that transparency and ensuring the rebates have a benefit to the consumer are critical issues. When we talk about West Virginia, we want to step back and maybe look at it like from a tactical move in a high stakes negotiation. It seems like a win because the rebates are getting directly passed through, but the real question is at what cost to the overall strategy? So West Virginia's pass-through model mandates that all negotiated rebates are directly passed on to the plan sponsor and ultimately the patients. It sounds straightforward, but the reality of it is it removes a significant negotiation tool that PBMs use to secure even deeper discounts from the drug manufacturers. And without that flexibility to negotiate how rebates and discounts are structured, we lose leverage to make those drugs more affordable.
Thank you for providing that additional information. Before Mr. Baker has the floor, my colleague Robert Judge had his hand up. Robert, you have the floor. And we have
Thank you,
about
Chair.
10 minutes left in this panel.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bailey. Ms. Neal, I just want to kind of follow up on that point because the penny didn't drop for me. When you said you lose negotiating leverage with manufacturers when it's passed through to payers and then down to consumers, what are you exactly referring to?
So imagine you're negotiating with a kidnapper and you give away your strongest leverage point up front. What happens is you get a quick concession, but you miss out on the opportunity to negotiate a better overall outcome. So the same principle applies here. By focusing solely on pass-through rebates, we might be leaving bigger savings on the table. In West Virginia's model, it ensures the rebates are transparent, but it doesn't account for the potential lost savings from not being able to leverage those rebates more effectively. And that's what PBMs bring to the table from a value standpoint, is to be able to look at the big picture, not just the one element of it, but be able to get as much savings as possible across the board for the client. Does that make sense?
Yeah. If I could just ask a follow-up, does it impact an ability to exert influence on formulary placement?
Can you restate that?
Yeah, I mean, in my experience, you use, from a payer's perspective, your tiering placement for drugs on formulary as a lever for negotiating, this is going to be preferred, non-preferred, etc. And that is a tool that's used in negotiating manufacturer rebates. I don't know if that's the main tool, but it is definitely a significant tool that we use. Does it affect that?
Yeah.
If it's passed through?
Your formulary management's a crucial leveraging tool for PBMs. It is not our only tool, but it is definitely one of our biggest tools that we have. And so you are going to be giving up one of those big tools.
Okay. Thank you.
And Mr. Baker, you had your hand up next. Oh, we cannot hear you, Mr. Baker. I believe you're on mute.
Thank you, ma'am. The one thing I want to go back to is we really consider what's best here in the state of Oregon. I ended my previous statement on anytime somebody uses the word rebates, that's bad. Rebates continues to come up. I think it is incredibly important to continue to be aware and recognize the fact that PBM is a separate legal entity from typically the GPO organization that is under affiliated ownership. When you legally say the PBM needs to do something, you're missing all of the money that's kept over here on this GPO piece that never makes it to the PBM. And then we don't have true understanding of costs and full negotiating power associated with driving better value. So again, I would strongly encourage that any legislation that is created in Oregon attacks the affiliated entities and the ultimate contractor to pharma and understands all financial revenue that comes from pharma, not just what that entity wants to deem a rebate and then pass to the PBM. So the PBM can, in our opinion, incorrectly state that they passed 99% of rebate dollars on, therefore they're good, because there's significant funds, again, to the tune of the Oversight and Accountability Office committee meeting yesterday. About $7.6 billion in fees were kept in 2022 by just 3 entities that do these GPO rebates. And that's money that should be going to the American taxpayer and Oregonians themselves. So just a word of caution.
Mr. Baker, thank you for that feedback. My colleague, board member, Mr. Chris Lehman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. Tanya, I had just one more question. Robert was trying to get at it a little bit, but I'm still a little unclear on how, when the rebate gets passed on to the consumer, how the PBM loses leverage. Because I mean, you're still negotiating that rebate, but instead of the PBM keeping that money, it's getting passed on to the consumer. So how, I mean, I understand how it's affecting the PBM financially, but how is it costing you leverage in terms of the negotiation with the pharmaceutical company?
So and Lugina may be better at answering this since she works for one of the companies. What I would say is it reduces some of the tiered bargaining chips that and you have to negotiate larger rebates with the drug manufacturers. If all the rebates are going to be passed through directly to the consumers, manufacturers have less incentive to offer significant rebates because they know the PBM can no longer use formulary placement as an effective affordability issue. So it weakens the formulary management, which is one of our critical tools against the drug manufacturers who have the ultimate say in what the cost of those drugs are going to be. And anytime we lose one of the tools that we use with the manufacturers, it's going to it's going to reduce competition and cause the cost of the drugs to increase.
Thanks.
Lugina, you may have our final comments as we have 90 seconds remaining. So you have the floor.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to respond to the point that Mr. Baker made. Certainly appreciate that. And I think he definitely makes a good point. And I just want to point out that in Oregon statute, there's been a pretty purposeful and an intentional approach to how PBMs are required to report. And I'm just looking at the wording now. It says that we have to report the aggregated dollar amount of rebates, fees, price protection payments, and any other payments the PBM receives from manufacturers. So I just want to let you know that there has been some intentional purposeful language in your statute that I think should address that point that Mr. Baker raised.
Thank you for that. So we have 30 seconds remaining. Greg, if you can do 15, and Chris, you can add 15. We can proceed.
I would just like to point out legally, PBMs get no money directly from manufacturers. The money goes from the manufacturer to the GPO to the PBM. So that legislative language actually does not account for the problem that exists.
Thank you for that information. And Chris Lehman, you have the floor.
And I just had a clarifying question about how frequently is that data required to be submitted to the state? So is that at the beginning of each year? Is there a time period that the previous year's data has to be submitted? I know we've struggled with some lags in the timeliness of getting some of the data.
Sure, Chris,
Yes,
it's
yes,
Ralph.
sir.
I can speak to that, or Lugina certainly, and she's correct that we did work closely in developing language on that bill. This will be our first year of the program. PBMs were to have submitted all of their information no later than June 1st of this year, and the PDAB sibling program, the Drug Price Transparency Program, is prepping all of that information to share and post on our website prior to October 1st, and so we look forward to getting that up. Thank you.
Thank you.
And just to follow up to Chair Lehman's question, it is June 1st, and we have to report that every year, and it's for the previous calendar year's information. So it'll be an ongoing reporting structure.
Thank you. Well, thank you to everyone for this fruitful discussion. Our next panel is panel 3. So all panel 2 participants, please turn off your cameras and mics. Welcome to panel 3, which are insurers. And the attendees that we have here today are Justin Weiss, VP of Pharmacy Operations and Compliance at Cambia, at Cambia Health Solutions, and Rick Blackwell from Pacific Source Health Plans. Gentlemen, if you could both please turn on your cameras. I'd like to remind everyone we have 15 minutes for this panel. So as I set my timer, I will also, I guess, kick off this panel by mentioning that some constituents have suggested that certain benefit design strategies, for example, carve outs, point of sale models, have direct impacts on drug affordability for patients. So I'd like to ask the two panelists here today, how common are these types of strategies in your benefit design considerations and or plan offerings? Would either of you, oh, looks like Justin has, or you both have your hands raised. So Justin, I saw yours first. You have the floor.
Hi, good morning, everyone. You may recognize the company that I represent better if I mention that we operate Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield in the state of Oregon. I caught part of the question around carve-outs and some of the, what I kind of call alternative funding programs that have emerged in the pharmacy benefit market over the last few years. I think the answer differs depending upon these particularly type of insurance plan that's being discussed. Sometimes when we talk about drug reform and drug pricing, right, it's easy to talk about the entire industry. I think my experience is the majority of carve-out solutions in some of those programs, right, where we don't cover this drug and it's going to get pushed to a manufacturer assistance program, are largely in the ERISA ASO spaces. From my experience, we don't have a lot of those programs for very certain reasons in our fully insured book of business and independent book of business. And of course, those type of programs are not allowed in Medicare. So I think that's a concern that we have because we think it disrupts continuity of care for members where there's different pharmacies involved and there's different acquisition of drugs. And we see that as a attempted solution on a bigger problem.
Thank you for that. The part that I also didn't highlight as I was kind of rambling was related to our previous discussion with PBMs related to point of sale discounts and how that might impact your plan design decisions.
Sure. So as a health plan, right, we rely on PBM partners to help us adjudicate claims, and we delegate specific work in the pharmacy benefit management space to these partners, including things like pharmacy network contracting. And of course, the group was talking earlier about rebates and manufacturer negotiation. From an insurance point of view, when I think about things like point of service discounts, those are contractual relationships very similar to what we see across the healthcare space with providers, hospitals, physicians, right? There's a rate between the insurance company and the provider. We use PBMs to help us do that with pharmacies. The concept of point of service rebates, my view on that is a point of service rebate can absolutely help the member that is on a rebated drug if the point of service rebate can be handed through the transaction to help the member reduce the cost on their prescription. But that's basically a cost shift, right? Today, as a health insurer, we take rebate dollars and we apply those to the client, the group that we're working with, in an attempt to reduce the overall premium. So we get a lot of attention on what the cost of the claim is at the pharmacy, but we have to think about this in totality. If you give those rebates at point of service to the member, that's a very good experience for the member, right? The member that's in critical care need, that's on very expensive medications. That rebate then does not exist for the actuarial pricing of the group. And the rest of that group is probably going to pay higher premiums. So there's multiple cost levers involved. I think most of the concerns that I've heard really resonate to that member patient experience, right? Because that's the one that really hits people. I have a $5,000 bill. That's very hard to understand. And it's a very complex world. And it feels like it's all coming at the patient. But when you talk about shifting point of service rebate dollars, we have to remember that that will take dollars away today that are used to help reduce the cost of premium. And that's also an important lever in health insurance, right? Members have two types of costs. They have their premium costs, oftentimes partially paid by their employer or where they get their benefits, and then they have their out-of-pocket costs, right? So we have to keep in mind there's a balance between two. And if you start moving dollars from one to another, it's going to have an impact to that plan in some regard.
Thank you for that information. Mr. Kennedy, do you have a follow-up to what Mr. Weiss said? Or if not, I'll let Mr. Blackwell answer the question.
I have a quick follow-up. Justin, you mentioned that the costs may be different, or the cost shift may be different for ERISA or ASO plans. So I know what an ASO plan is, but I'm wondering if you can speak to ASO plans for the rest of the group.
Right. So yeah. So we think of things in terms of like commercial insurance, right? So there's two different ways. Essentially, this is very simplistic. There's two different ways for an employer to acquire insurance. They can go to a health plan like Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield and say, I would like to buy one of your fully insured, and here's my premium, and here's the standard package that I get. If I'm a larger employer, I can take upon using an insurance company as essentially an administrator of my benefits, but I am, as the employer, the fiduciary and responsible for serving basically as the health plan sponsor. And when I'm in that role, I can make a lot more decisions on what I want to provide for my members. I can choose to have a health insurer be my full administrator, or I can choose to go work with a PBM directly for my pharmacy benefit management. So oftentimes there's confusion because what we see is the insurance card that's presented at the pharmacy or the provider, and not a lot of recognition on their very different types of insurance plans. In an ASO or ERISA plan, where somebody's self-insured, a company like ours, Regents Blue Cross Blue Shield, we're essentially the administrator of the benefit on behalf of the employer, right? They come to us because we know the space. We can help them negotiate. We have networks. We have services that we can help them administer their plan, but they're effectively the fiduciary and the responsible party for setting up their insurance plan.
Thank you, Mr. Weiss. Mr. Blackwell, with our 7 approximate minutes left, do you have any direct response to that first question, or you'd like to add to what Mr. Weiss presented?
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bailey and board members. Again, Rick Blackwell, I'm the Government Relations Director here with Pacific Source. I would 100% agree with Justin's assessment, particularly around rebates. I think, rebates help spread the cost of prescription drugs across an entire risk pool, a risk pool that's paying premiums. Point of sale may help someone understand, may map the true cost of the drug to the entire population that's being served by us. But to your question about whether our benefit design strategies are kind of driving cost, I think I understand if that's the question that I understood it to be. I think it's actually the opposite. We're probably one of the only players in the healthcare marketplace whose rates are tightly controlled by DCBS. We also, we file plans every year, or rates every year that have to be reasonable and not excessive. And we also have to adhere to certain metal level design benefit designs that are part of the Affordable Care Act. If you've ever looked at kind of the smorgasbord of bad choices that maybe an 85% AV plan, actuarial value plan makes, do you raise a prescription drug benefit, or do you lower, some other, this primary care is more costly? Like, we're reflecting costs throughout the system in the way that we have to design benefits. And so I think understanding that if we're reflecting costs, the input that represents the high cost of prescription drugs is going to make us make choices that we have to present to our regulators as to what plans look like. So I think actually the opposite is true, at least from our perspective as a health carrier.
Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Weiss, your hand is up.
Yeah, I'd like to pivot back real quickly, if I can, to the concept as we've been participating in this board around UPLs. So the board has shared with us, basically a schematic on how UPLs will work through the pharmacy supply chain. And I just want to take a moment, if people haven't gotten familiar with that visual, I think it's a nice breakdown, right? Starts with what the manufacturer can sell the drug for, what the wholesaler then can acquire it for, how the wholesaler will sell it to the pharmacy or the hospital, the provider. Then there's the member transaction, the PBM transaction. Hopefully people are familiar with this. As basically the last outlet there, the health insurer. The question that I'm asking for the board and for regulators in Oregon to help us understand is, what happens if those contracts along the way aren't compliant? Because we are at the end of the payment cycle. And if people aren't being held responsible to the UPL levels, to some extent, this is limiting the amount of dollars that can take place in each of those transactions in the supply chain. What happens when it gets to the final point with the insurer and our UPL calculation indicates that we're going to pay X dollars on the claim, and the entity like the pharmacy or the hospital says, but that's less than what I paid for. So I think there's a lot of work to be done. As a pharmacist that spent 25 years in managed care, I really want to understand how we're going to operationalize a set of drugs in a very complex environment for reimbursement, right? And it's complex because there is a lot of transactions that happen in the supply chain. So my challenge back to the board and to the regulators is, what's the overall regulatory control? Because we're talking about regulatory control on wholesalers, on providers, on PBMs, and on health plans. It's a complicated payment world, and I think we can sit here all day and say it's not the right payment. And then the final piece that I have is a question is, healthcare is interstate, particularly if you look at Portland. We have a lot of members that are in health plans domiciled in the state of Oregon, that live in Oregon but receive care in Washington. So when I look at things like UPL controls, what happens when we start talking about interstate commerce? These are the questions that I try to solve, because whatever gets decided, we have to be able to operationalize, right? Through a compliant manner on the best fiduciary responsibility for our clients, employers, and others, and ultimately to make sure that the member is the recipient of whatever rule and regulations passed. But I just want to remind the group that healthcare does not stop at the borders of the state. It is increasingly interstate. We have, employer groups who are domiciled in Oregon, and we're going to have to do something for those that are getting care in the state. But they may have employees that live in other states. So we really need some very specific set of standards for us to go through and overwrite and change claim systems, which deal with transaction volumes that probably will blow a lot of people's minds in terms of how many transactions happen. So those are the type of questions that I bring forward with the right intent, because we are all trying to solve this issue for the members, for our communities, for everybody involved. But those are the things that kind of give me heartburn, because I don't fully understand how the operation is.
Well, thank you. Thank you for sharing this. We have, to my colleagues here on the board, we have about 2 minutes left. So although I have a list of questions I'm happy to ask, with hearing everything we've heard, do any of my colleagues have follow-up or new questions we'd like to discuss in these remaining minutes? Robert Judge, I saw you had your hand up. And now you're on mute.
I always have ideas bouncing around my head, but no, Mr. Weiss, I really appreciate the comments that you made, because that was getting to the questions that I was asking in my head. I totally understand that there's potential value in upper payment limits in terms of the affordability of health insurance, premiums for plan sponsors, as well as premium costs to individuals or beneficiaries. But how you operationalize that, essentially, in my view, is, who pays and how does this get operationalized are the big questions that we as a board would have to contend with as we figure out a way to go forward with payment limits. So your comments were resolve my question. And I think I just ate a bunch of time in saying that, Shelley, so I apologize.
Well, that was the remaining time we had available. I want to make sure that all my colleagues are able to ask all the questions that they have. So again, thank you so much, both panelists here today for helping to answer some of our questions. So we now move to panel 4, which is our manufacturer panel. Again, I do want to remind everyone here that we have 15 minutes for this discussion. So as we ask questions, please work to keep the answers brief. But related to those that I would like to please turn on your camera and your microphone are Brett Michelin, Senior Director of State Government Affairs from the Association for Accessible Medicines, representing both generic and biosimilar manufacturers. We also have Brian Warren, Senior Director of State Government Affairs for the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. We have Lisa Bosnovic, Executive Director for Oregon Bioscience Association. And we have Daria McGrew, Director of State Policy for Pharma. So welcome all 4 panelists. Hopefully you have your cameras on and your microphones on as well. So I'll start us off with our first essentially prompt question today. But, so we've had a lot of discussion today, or I guess I should confirm, do we have all attendees here before we proceed?
Yes, Chair Bailey, we do.
Have all panelists? Thank you very much for confirming, Courtney. So we've kind of heard throughout these listening sessions and things from manufacturers that there has been a willingness to provide certain types of information to the board in a confidential way to help us make some of our decisions. We recognize the importance of data for our affordability reviews, as well as in our efforts to develop associated UPL strategies. So we would to better kind of understand the requirements. So I guess I just want to ask the panelists here today, what specific protections and structures would be required from manufacturers in order to share this type of confidential information with the board? For example, statutory protections, regulations, contractual. We would like to hear from the panelists today on how we might be able to structure something that would give the board this type of confidential information in a mechanism that's agreeable to manufacturers. Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. Yeah, so manufacturers are required to submit information that normally would not be public to, for example, to DCBS as part of the HB 4005 Drug Transparency Program. Other information submitted to this, as well as other state PDABs. As you can imagine, as manufacturers, different manufacturers compete against themselves, as well as they're also in negotiating relationships with PBMs, health plans, and others. There's a lot of information that would be anti-competitive for it to be released that could actually result in an increase of costs, for example. As well as could lead a manufacturer to lose some of its competitive edge. So often different states have established different protections. At the very least, a statutory exemption from public disclosure would be necessary. I know that one of the problems as it relates to discussion of confidential information as it's related to this board has been that the statutory structure of the Public Meetings Act does not allow you all as board, even when you're meeting an executive session, to exclude media from the discussion, for example. So like the Colorado PDAB, they meet an executive session when they're discussing rebate data or other proprietary information. Media is not allowed there. That's an assurance that that information is not going to get out. So some of these changes may need to be statutory. Also, there are, I think that we've been trying to increase some of the protections for proprietary information in the HB 4005 Drug Transparency Program. There are other states that, and I could probably provide you a better response in writing in terms of specific examples, but there are things where it's an agreement between the manufacturer and the state agency that is being submitted to both the scope of what has to be submitted as well as how that will be protected.
Okay, thank you for sharing that. Does anyone here on the panel have any additional information specifically related to that, or kind of as a complement, are there other states or organizations that have developed models that we might want to look at? So Ms. McGrew, you have the floor.
Thank you. Just, I think Brian covered it, and this is something that we have submitted in our letters over the past 2 years. We have, and we can go back and revisit that and submit to the board again, specifically what would be better protections, but agree that manufacturers need the ability to submit information and questions to the board in a confidential way if they're, and raise concerns about data that they've seen in the data that is being looked at. That has happened in the last year and has been an issue. Thank you.
Thank you. And Brett, you have the floor.
Yeah, I would just say very briefly on the generic side, our marketplace operates just a little bit differently than on the branded side. So for us, typically we're responding to a request for sales from a wholesaler. So our competition is, and why we can't allow our prices to be known, is ours is a race to the bottom on the generic side. The wholesalers are looking at who's going to provide just really 2 things. One, can you supply the amount of that particular drug we need, and what is your lowest cost? And so if some of that information starts going public pre-sale, what Mr. Warren mentioned is absolutely going to impact on the generic side, because it will give manufacturers information where they can increase their price and still be the lowest price. If that's making sense to you, because that's the competition, direct head-to-head for molecule-to-molecule sales.
Thank you for sharing those insights with us. So I guess, in some of the discussions we've had, constituents have suggested kind of the definition of affordability should be kind of better refined and defined. And as a board, that's something we've also discussed previously. So what factors beyond kind of manufacturer costs for a given drug should the board consider in our definitions? Like, what type of data should be included, and from what constituents should we obtain this? Kind of thinking of what the premium impact would be on carriers, copays, out of pocket from carriers. We obviously heard from carriers and PBMs, but what are some of the additional things that we should be thinking about as a board to help us as we really kind of look at and define affordability? Brian, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think that in terms of every single specific thing you can look at, that's a tough thing to say. I would say that what a patient is paying out of pocket when they walk into the pharmacy to collect a medicine should be the primary measure of whether or not something is affordable. Because the cost of a drug, if it's being rebated or whether those rebates are being passed down, is a lot harder to say that the impact that is going to have on the patient's affordability. The biggest impact that a patient's going to have is when they walk into the pharmacy to get their prescription drug, what they're paying out of pocket. And unfortunately, that is a lot harder for you all to measure because different patients pay different amounts. 3 different patients can walk into the same pharmacy on the same day and pay 3 different amounts for the same exact medicine. It's because their cost sharing is determined by their insurance company or their PBM. And it's also why, absent some much stricter reforms in terms of what is done with savings from an upper payment limit, why an upper payment limit might not benefit many patients at all. The other thing that we would encourage you to take into consideration is value, because different medicines have different values. And just because something is expensive should not subject it to an upper payment limit by a body such as this. I think this was discussed at the last board meeting to some extent, where you have transformative medicines like cell and gene therapies that are hundreds of thousands, some of them even over $1 million. And for an individual patient, almost any individual patient, that would be unaffordable. However, that's why patients have insurance, and many of these medicines save money over the long run because they're actually have a hefty price tag on a single point of service they are curative, for example, and they prevent other more costly medical interventions down the road. So I guess the two things that, to recap, would be ensuring that we're looking at what patients are paying out of pocket and trying to impact that as closely and directly as possible. And then also ensuring that we're considering value, because just because something is expensive doesn't mean that anything's wrong with that product, for example.
Thank you for sharing that, Brian. Ms. McGrew, you have the floor.
Thank you. Yeah, want to second everything Brian said and just add on to that a little bit. First, we agree first and foremost, patient affordability should be first before you consider other factors. But what other factors can you look at also beyond a lot of the data that the board has been looking at? I think one of the things that has been missing in some of the conversation is provider perspective from a specialist point of view when you're looking at individual drugs that are often for chronic diseases. I want to make sure that the board is considering the medical providers who are working with these patients and these medicines day in and day out. They have very strong perspectives on the value of newer medications. Some of the contractors that have presented to the board have presented things as therapeutically equivalent or therapeutic alternatives that are, no longer considered modern therapeutic alternatives sometimes. Sometimes they're presenting something as equivalent when I think a specialist provider would say, I would never, that's outdated. That's not first line prescription anymore. I would never give that to a patient. So I think that could be added to the board's deliberations of affordability in the future.
Thank you. Ms. Bosnia-Vic, you have the floor.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Bailey. Just to continue to tease out that concept of value and answer your question about other factors you might look at, and in terms of out-of-pocket expenses to the patient, if you're comparing a medicine that you have to take once a year and versus one where it's multiple times and you have to take time off of work and drive to a clinic, it's not an apples to apples comparison necessarily there. So just another data point that I wanted to add.
Thank you for sharing that. Mr. Michelin.
Yeah, the one thing I would add in there is what is the lowest available cost of that particular drug? In the case of a generic drug, at some point, and what I'm getting at is what is market access, and where we're seeing issues on both biosimilar and some generic is the supply chain purchasing the lowest available product, and that's clearly not the case in multiple instances. You just look at Humira, it's now had biosimilars, multiple biosimilars now for well over a year and a half. And our market access is still relatively low. So the purchasers are buying higher cost drugs when lower costs are available. So that I believe should also be taken into consideration by the board, is what else is available.
Thank you for sharing that. So as we have about 2.5 minutes remaining, I do want to encourage my colleagues on the board here. Does anyone have, before I continue with my gigantic list of questions, do any of my colleagues on the board here have specific questions for manufacturers framed under the context of our UPL discussions? Mr. Robert Judge, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. So this is a kind of a broad question, and I think it gets to some of the information I've been listening to over the last year, 2 years, about kind of upper payment limits and kind of the impact on the industry. So from a manufacturer perspective, how would an upper payment limit method impact your pricing strategy for new and existing medications? And I'm asking it that way because I've heard a lot of comment from, especially on the advocacy side, saying that upper payments could limit innovation and the availability of drugs. I'd like to get your perspective on that.
Brett, you had your hand raised.
So I want to be very brief because this is primarily a question for the brand side. But the one thing I want to caution against is the unintended consequences of an upper payment limit. Don't forget, we're the follow-on drug. So, but if a upper payment limit is set too low, then the incentive for a generic or a biosimilar to come to market and compete, because that's proven either up to 90% on the generic side, 80% lower on the biosimilar side, it will be harder to come to market if the upper payment limit is set too low and the incentive is taken away for the follow-on products. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Michelin. So with our 45 seconds remaining, Ms. McGrew, you have the floor.
Thanks. I'll try to be super quick. I mean, we have raised concerns about price setting when it comes to access to medicine for multiple reasons. Mr. Judge was asking about innovation. Biopharmaceutical companies that can't recoup the cost, approximately $2.5 billion to bring a new drug to market, 90% failure rate. If they don't believe that they will be able to recoup a cost in the future, there's less incentive for them to invest in these spaces. So biopharmaceutical companies are making decisions 10, 15 years out on where their research is going to go. And they're looking at pricing at the federal government and states that are looking to do price setting and making those decisions. But additionally, in the state, there are concerns about access. We've raised concerns about along the supply chain. If you set one price, are other supply chain members going to be able to obtain the drug? And then if they cannot obtain the drug at that price in the state that has set that price, will it be available in the pharmacy? Will it be available in the hospital? And that is a direct access issue in the near term for patients right now, not looking 15 years in the future. But there's two different problems of access when you're talking about price setting.
Ms. McGrew, thank you for that. We are actually at time, but Mr. Warren and Ms. Bosnevich, do you have anything to add that's unique to what Ms. McGrew said before we move forward with other panels?
I would just briefly say that when it comes, there's been a lot of studies done of the impact on investment for innovative medicines from, like, for example, the federal laws about Medicare drug price negotiations. So we can send you some information on that. But really, it's the medicines that have the highest risk of failure, the riskiest type of science, that you're going to see investment pull back on. And unfortunately for that, you're talking about patient groups with a lot of unmet medical need, many rare disease patients and so forth. So there definitely would be an impact by capping the potential price of a medicine down the road.
Thank you, Mr. Moran. And Ms. Bosnevich, anything additional before we proceed? You're on mute, but if you have just a few seconds of additional information.
I do, yes, sorry. Really outside of this board scope and perhaps purview, the unique thing that I want to add is that as a regional trade association for the industry, we're really trying to build that in bioscience industry here in the state that comes with good, high-paying jobs and a lot of economic benefit to individuals in the state. And untested regulation like this really has a chilling effect on our ability to do that. So.
Thank you for the additional information, and we are going to go ahead and take a 5-minute break. Thank you to everyone. So welcome back, everyone. And I do want to mention that we are moving to panel number 5, which are advocacy organizations. And let's see, for panel number 5, we do have 25 minutes allocated for this discussion. And the attendees today for panel 5, please turn on your microphones and your cameras. And the following individuals will be participating. We have Leah Purvis from the Prescription Drug Policy Principal at AARP Public Policy Institute. Tiffany Westrich Robertson, Chief Executive Officer of AI Arthritis IFFAAA. Madonna McGuire Smith, Executive Director of the Bleeding Disorders Council. Kathleen Costello, ANPBC MSCN, Chief Operating Officer of Can Do Multiple Sclerosis. Lauren Sant, Executive Director of Caring Ambassadors Program. Corey Greenblatt, Director of State Policy and Advocacy for the Global Healthy Living Foundation. Gina Ross Murdoch, President and CEO of Multiple Sclerosis Association of America. Casey Minnis, Executive Director of the Multiple Sclerosis Foundation. Bill Robbie, State Government Relations Director for the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. Seth Grenier, Senior Manager Advocacy for the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Lucy Laub, State Government Relations Manager West of the National Psoriasis Foundation. John Mullen, President, Oregon Coalition for Affordable Prescriptions, and Sarah Van Eastruden, Executive Director of the Partnership to Improve Patient Care. Welcome to all those individuals here. I do want to mention Charlie Fisher has raised their hand. Can someone confirm Charlie?
Sorry, I thought I had been on here. I don't see my name, and you can tell me whether I am
Okay,
allowed
thank
to
you,
speak or
Charlie.
not.
I'm going to confirm with Steve or Courtney that you had advanced registration for this panel. So if you don't mind muting and keeping your camera off until I can confirm that, I would appreciate it. And Steve or Courtney, did you hear that my request to confirm Charlie's registration?
We did. We'll look into it. Thanks.
Okay, thank you for looking into it. As soon as I receive that confirmation, I will announce it here during the panel, but I will proceed. So welcome everyone. Thanks for having your cameras on and your audio on. So
Wait,
as
quick, I apologize for interrupting, but yes, he can join. He's part of the.
Charlie,
Yeah.
I apologize that we missed your name on this slide. So welcome. Thank you. So we have Charlie Fisher. What organization are you from?
I'm with OSPERG. We're a statewide public interest group.
Thank you. Just want to make sure to reference that accurately. So again, welcome. So advocacy groups here and their representatives had made many recommendations that the board should consider to address drug affordability here in Oregon. We recognize the importance of these recommendations, and we would like to better understand how we might move forward. So I guess my first question to the panelists here today is that many constituents have suggested that the board consider a UPL feasibility study. What exactly would this group recommend to be studied? Who should be engaged in completing such a study? And what types of information or data should the board be seeking to obtain? So I know that was a big, long question, but if anyone here would like to raise your hand related to that specific question, I welcome feedback for the board. Ms. Minnis, you have the floor.
Thank you. I think that one thing that would need to be included is looking at the effects of similar processes that have already taken place. One concern that we have is looking at what happened when the price of insulin was capped. One of the major issues to access, and one of the things that is contributing to the current insulin shortage, is the fact that certain manufacturers, when the price was capped and it was no longer as profitable for them, shifted their focus away from producing insulin and to producing more profitable medications. And that has led to a situation where, in some cases, type 1 diabetics dependent on insulin to live are struggling to get their medications, and in some cases are having to go to a hospital to get their medication in order just to be able to get through until the pharmacy can acquire it. So that's a serious concern for conditions that have these kind of severe life-threatening or ability-threatening effects. As a multiple sclerosis organization, we're very concerned that if upper price limits are set and lead to supply chain issues, formulary acceptance issues, or other issues that affect access for patients, it's not like cholesterol where you're risking a slow accumulation of damage. A person with MS who doesn't have their medication is risking damage, irreversible damage to their brain. So to the point of value that was raised earlier, that's something that needs to be considered, the level of risk that the not having access to these medications would take on. So I think looking at the example of what's already occurred with price limitations, and also perhaps having a study undertaken where the PBMs, the insurers, the manufacturers can give their feedback anonymously on what is actually likely to happen. What are their organization's plans if these upper payment limits are set in place, to better understand what these effects are likely to be?
Thank you. Ms. Westridge Robertson, I believe you had your hand up next.
Thank you very much. I would like to just say, as we're thinking about feasibility studies, and first of all, thank you so much for this opportunity. I think it's absolutely wonderful that what you're doing here, and appreciate the opportunity. One of the things that I really encourage you all to think about is feasible for who. Sort of going back to the affordability question we had before, Oregon's really presented with a very complex situation where the affordability is about the consumer, but it's also about the state. It's also about other healthcare entities, unlike other states that may have gone before, like Colorado, which is consumer. So identifying the stakeholder groups, the affordability for whom, but then also zeroing in on that data, which I know was also brought up earlier. We have to remember that the UPL, once it's set, if it's set, then it moves on to our complex healthcare system. It still goes through the same channels. We're still dealing with the same problems. And a UPL isn't going to be effective if the transparency issues that are happening behind closed doors from all parties, PBM, manufacturer, whomever is having these conversations, we need to make sure, we don't put the cart before the horse. But what I mean about data in particular is really understanding, if we put the UPL or the methodology into effect, what are the case scenarios? How feasible is it? How feasible is it to produce savings for the patient? How feasible is it? So you need the endpoints, and a lot of the data and the surveys that we've seen out there are just missing the endpoints. So that's really what I want to encourage in doing a feasibility study.
Thank you. So I have a hard time determining order, but I think maybe who had their hand up next was Mr. Robbie, or
Actually, so Chair Bailey, I apologize again for interrupting. It would be Sarah Van. And I just want to remind the constituents to please keep your messages brief. We have a lot of hands we need to get through, so please stick to the point of the question that is being asked. Thanks, Chair Bailey.
Perfect. So Ms. Van Gertruden, you have the floor, I believe.
Thank you. Just thinking about the who, the data, I'm trying to remember the entire question, just constructive criticism is to have these questions in advance would be really helpful in the future. Just in terms of sort of best practices for engagement. But, I will say that this has been a tremendous engagement so far. So I've learned a lot, and I appreciate it. So on the who, obviously, I think the patients that are here can provide some really critical feedback. I've heard a lot here about, I appreciated on panel 1, too, the issue brought up about duplicity of tests. And I think looking at this in a more holistic way in terms of what patients' costs are throughout the system is important. Thinking about this, too, in the context of, I heard there was some discussion around therapeutic equivalence earlier. Therapeutic equivalence isn't always therapeutic. Different patients have different needs. Not all patients respond to the same treatment the same. Tony Coelho, who is our chairman, often says no patient is average, and that is absolutely true, particularly in the patient and disability communities. People with long-term disabilities and chronic diseases, which I think is a significant focus here. And in terms of the kind of data that you're using, from our perspective, want to point out that the quality adjusted life year and similar measures like the equal value life year gained are measures that are discriminatory by law, have been banned. I know we've already sent you a letter to that effect around the new non-discrimination rules that were passed by the federal government last May. But want to make sure too that there's some transparency there, which I think Tiffany brought up, because if we don't understand what evidence is being used behind the scenes, at least the kind of evidence that isn't proprietary and that we can see, you can get a lot of information from the patients by sharing that evidence, and they can help you understand whether it is genuinely representative of the patient community, because sometimes those studies are not particularly representative, right? Sometimes they don't include all the subpopulations that need to be included.
Thank you for your feedback. So with our 14 minutes remaining, I am struggling to keep order, but possibly is it Mr. Bill Roby who is next, or Courtney, maybe you could help me. It's
Yeah,
difficult.
thanks. It's Lauren Sant.
Lauren, you have the floor.
Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you, Chair Bailey, for holding this. It's really important. So Justin made a really good point that the UPL model is really complicated and how it's going to go through the whole process. And so if we're going to do a feasibility study, I think really looking at where that's going to impact everyone and what that's going to look like. But also, is this going to be a model for all drugs in Oregon, or are just the UPL is going to have this special process? Because that's not going to work. If we need a model for how all drugs are going to be done, not just the ones that are deemed unaffordable or need to have an upper payment limit. And Ralph, at the beginning, you mentioned it's everybody. The system, if we're going to change drug affordability, it's the entire system. You're right. It's all of it that we have to work with. And that includes hospitals. So I just want to throw that out there. And if we're going to look at a feasibility study, make sure we're including every member of the circle that needs to happen. So thank you.
Thank you, Lauren, very much. And so the next person on our list here, I'm getting some help, some support from my colleagues here, I believe is Seth Grenier. Seth, welcome, and you have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. Seth Greiner with the National Multiple Sclerosis Society. Specific to your question, what information and data should we gather? The MS Society would be very curious about DMTs, disease-modifying therapies for MS, that have been on the market for a long time and have seen exponential cost growth. The first DMT was introduced in 1993. It had a WAC of $11,000. That same DMT, without any formulaic changes, now has a WAC of $126,000. So the society would be very interested to see where the Oregon board could come up with some answers to those questions related to exactly time on market and cost growth. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that comment. Mr. John Mollett, you have the floor.
Apologize, Chair. Amy did have her hand up. Do you want to call, see if Amy has a follow-up question?
Oh, yes, I missed that Vice Chair Burns had her hand.
Absolutely, no problem. I was just wondering, and I appreciate that the last speaker did this. Is it possible that the speakers can give the organization they're with before they begin speaking, just so we can follow through? I'm having a hard time because I don't necessarily see your organization in front of, or put it in your name. That might be helpful. That was all. Thank you.
Thank you for that feedback. So, Mr. Mullen, you now have the floor.
Okay, thank you, Chair and members of the board. John Mullen, and I'm board president of the Oregon Coalition for Affordable Prescriptions. And I'm just going to begin, and I have a number of simple comments to make, but just begin by stealing an advocacy mantra from another advocacy effort. Drug prices are too damn high. And the thing that has driven OCAP all along has been transparency of the industry as well as affordability. So I think that the feasibility study, which we supported and worked on Senate Bill 192, should have as its overarching directive is to look at affordability in the system in creating a UPL feasibility study. We are at this point in time very supportive of the feasibility study. We will hold off on any further action till we see what the board comes up with. But again, affordability has to govern this issue. Thank you.
Mr. Mullen, thank you for your feedback. Not seeing other raised hands from my colleagues, I would like to give Mr. Bill Roby the floor, keeping in mind we have about 9.5 minutes remaining in this panel.
Thank you, Chair Bailey. Bill Roby with the National Bleeding Disorders Foundation. I'll try to be really quick here. In terms of a feasibility study, I think one of the important things, and for the people in the bleeding disorders community, we have 3 of the about 15 gene therapies out there on the market with another on the way. Mr. Warren mentioned these earlier. How do you address rare disease therapies, which are by their nature very difficult to come up with therapies for? Most rare diseases don't have any kind of treatment. When you have a small population to recoup those costs, they are by their nature going to be expensive. Just something to consider in this whole process. For people with hemophilia and other bleeding disorders, in my lifetime, they've gone from where hemophilia was a death sentence to now people with hemophilia can live a normal lifespan and die of old age or something else. So that value proposition in the rare disease space, especially, I think deserves a little bit different consideration than other very expensive drugs that are out there as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Fisher, in order of operations, your hand was up next. You have the floor.
Okay. Well, thanks for having me. And again, I'm with OSPERG. We're a statewide public interest group. We're member funded. We have thousands of members around the state. And I mean, I think to your question, you know, from our perspective, the number one data point is the impact on the public and consumers. And so I just wanted to share a story from someone that we've talked to who takes Eliquis and a digestive medication. She said last year the cost for a 3-month supply of Eliquis went up 4 times, from $100 something to over $400. And when she first filled her prescription for her digestive medication, it cost $125 for a 29-day supply. And when she went to refill it, it was all the way up to $729 for the same 29-day supply, a price I could not afford, she said. And I think, you know, we hear about this all the time, folks who are just experiencing the high cost of prescription drugs. Another data point that I'd just share is we did a survey of Oregonians. 17% said they did not purchase prescribed medication in the last year because of the cost. 12% said they skipped doses or decreased dosage amounts of prescribed medication because of the cost. And so I think this is really, you know, what we need to ground our work in. And, you know, I guess as it pertains to the feasibility study, we've been part of the focus groups, and I just think that the process that you're currently undergoing is a good one. And we're confident that you're going to get the information you need to be able to come up with a strong recommendation. And so, yeah, we just urge you to stay the course, and are excited to see what comes out of the really great work that you all are doing.
Thank you for your comments, Mr. Fisher. I believe that Mr. Greenblatt had his hand raised next. Mr. Corey Greenblatt, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, everyone. Corey Greenblatt with the Global Healthy Living Foundation. I want to echo something that Tiffany said earlier about part of the feasibility study. Before going into it, I think we need to understand what the ultimate goal of this study is, who the ultimate benefactor, who the ultimate person that is being helped by this process is going to be. And if the answer to that, if the ultimate goal is to help patients, part of the feasibility study has to include what happens if a UPL is set and smaller pharmacies or local pharmacies are no longer able to stock medication because they cannot stock medications at that number. That will inevitably push patients to larger national specialty pharmacies that will inevitably have to ship medication. We have had to work with patients that have lost medication because it's been shipped incorrectly by specialty pharmacies. And as it's been mentioned already, we're dealing with patients that if they skip a medication or if they lose access to a medication, one treatment could have an impact that puts them out of work for a week. So it's not just something, it's not like not taking Advil for a day. So I think it's very important to make sure that while studying the impact of the UPL, it's also studying the impact of where patients are getting their medications and how they will get their medications following any UPL decision. I think that's everything for me to keep it brief. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Greenblatt. So while we have just under 5 minutes remaining, my colleague, Mr. Robert Judge, does have a question. I want to recognize we do have 4 more speakers who have raised their hand, but Mr. Judge, do you have a question for any of the previous?
Yes, for Mr. Greenblatt, just a clarification on what he was referring to on pharmacies not being able to stock inventory if a upper payment level was set for a drug that they could not stock. Are you inferring or assuming that an upper payment level would be a reimbursement to a pharmacy solely? So the cost would be what the cost is, but the pharmacy would get paid whatever the PDAB establishes as the upper payment limit?
So
as opposed to a rebate on the back end.
Sure. So as we have seen upper payment limits be proposed and enacted in different places, they function more as a reimbursement cap than actually what a patient pays. So as a reimbursement cap, it would limit how much a pharmacy is able to get reimbursed for said medication. So if that reimbursement cap is lower than a pharmacy is able to stock at a point where it is able to actually make enough money to stock the medication without stocking it at a loss, many smaller pharmacies may choose not to stock it at all.
Yep. Got it. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you for that clarifying question and follow-up comment. So I believe with the hand raised next is Ms. Kathy Costello. Ms. Costello, you have the floor.
Thanks very much. Kathy Costello from Can Do Multiple Sclerosis. Thank you very much, Chair Bailey and the board for having this and also considering this feasibility study. As I've listened to others, I certainly don't disagree with anything that's been said. My clarifying points are that when you look at having a feasibility study, look at the other research that's previously been done and what was identified in those studies. One that comes to mind is one that was conducted by Avalier. It was an interview study that was quite in depth, but it was missing on certain pieces in that many of the responses were based on, well, our decision would be based on what the actual upper payment limit might be. And so in designing a feasibility study, you may want to consider what different levels of upper payment limits have on the responses that you receive. Clearly, take a look at the goals. Who is this benefiting? Is it benefiting the system? Is it benefiting the individual? And hopefully both. Who are truly all of the stakeholders that are involved, from people living with the disease, for example, to the PBMs, the insurers, and the providers. In some disease spaces, there are drugs that are infused, for example, by a provider in their office, and this could change their payment structure and their ability to provide a medication for specific patients. So each of these things need to be carefully considered as you construct your feasibility study. Again, goals, stakeholders, the potential risks, the potential benefits, which will also help to construct the questions that you ask to get at answers that may inform how you proceed with upper payment limits. Thanks very much.
Thank you. So with our few minutes remaining, next on our list is Ms. Gina Murdoch. Ms. Murdoch, you have the floor.
Thank you. Gina Murdoch, the Multiple Sclerosis Association of America, and just asking in the feasibility study to look at what might end up to be changes in formularies or cost sharing aspects for the patients. We look very kind of building on what Ms. Minnis said, is this MS is a progressive disease. So if we're looking at changes in formulary, there's more cost to the patients. That may be driving decisions on prescribing based on reimbursement. So when we're looking at it, we may be saving costs on the front part of it, but also looking at the roll-off costs that may not be encompassed in this decision but may result in more disability, more costs, loss of income, loss of employment. So there are areas that changes in what is accessible to a patient, and the right patient, the right medication for the right patient at the right time may not have drug costs, but may have burden costs to the patient. So just looking at what change in one area in a very complex health system really ripples through all the other areas that will be ultimately what is the burden on the patient. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Murdoch. So we have just a minute or two remaining. So Ms. Purvis, I believe your hand was up next.
Thank you. And fortunately, I'm a fast talker. I'm Lee Purvis with AARP, and I just wanted to kind of echo some prior comments about the importance of doing your homework, but then also recognizing that a lot of this type of work is already occurring at the federal and at state level. There are 11 states that have already established PDABs. There are more than a dozen that are considering it. And I think this is a really good opportunity to take some lessons learned and potentially use that to move forward as expediently as possible. I think it's also really important to point out that the pharmaceutical industry is already selling the same drug at many different price points to many different payers in many different distribution channels. And I think that needs to be top of mind whenever potential roadblocks are pointed out in terms of how this system may actually work. And finally, first and foremost, the reason that we're all here today, I really strongly urge the board to continue moving forward as quickly as possible, because the reality is there are just too many patients who are really struggling to afford the drugs they need.
Thank you very much. And Ms. Lucy Laub, you have the floor.
Thanks. I'll be quick, and I want to say that I agree with everything that's been said before, so I don't need to reiterate that. I did want to touch on something. I think it was Kathy that mentioned the Avalier report, because we do have some existing data. Oh, sorry, I'm from the National Psoriasis Foundation. Yes, so I just want to point out the importance of the impact on patients, not just their affordability out of pocket, but also their experience with utilization management and formulary structures. So that data would be really important for us to see, making sure that there's not changes to how drugs are tiered and affecting patients' access to it. Utilization management, such as step therapy, also plays into affordability for patients. It affects their health and can lead to irreversible damage, but it also can lead to increased cost to the patient if they have to go to the hospital because they can't get the medication that is first-line treatment from their doctor.
Thank you very much for sharing this. So I do apologize to everyone. We didn't get through more questions, but we do have just a few seconds here remaining. So Lauren, I want to recognize that your hand is raised.
Thanks, Shelley. And actually what I was going to say is, can you send us the questions so we can answer them for you guys? Because I know we'd all love to answer all your questions. So if you could send us your list of questions, I'm sure everyone here would be happy to send it to you guys in writing.
Yeah, thank you. We welcome all feedback related to the UPL. These were just some of my personal notes to make sure that we had productive discussion. But with everyone here today, we obviously have a lot of knowledge and productive discussion. So thank you so much, Lauren. So again, thank you to all participants. And again, I do want to reinforce kind of along the point that Lauren made that as a board, we are very open to the feedback that we receive. So any comments that want to be shared with the board can be sent through our PDAB website, and that all that information is distributed to all board members. So again, thank you to all panelists today for being here and for having your cameras and mics on. I do now want to move us to panel 6, which are our pharmacy constituents. I will remind everyone here today that our panel is a 25-minute panel, and I'm going to go ahead and read off the list of attendees here. We have Ms. Caitlin Malone, Director of Procurement at Albertsons, Melanie Maxwell, President of Align RX, Michael Murphy, Senior Advisor for State and Government Affairs at the American Pharmacists Association, Thad Mick, Chief Clinical and Innovation Officer at Arden Health Holdings, LLC, Priyal Patel, pharmacist and co-owner of Broadway Pharmacy in North Bend, who's also a member of the Oregon Board of Pharmacy, Pat Hubble, pharmacist and owner of Brooklyn Pharmacy, Austin Blakesley, Director of Pharmacy at High School Pharmacy, John Covello, Senior Director of Government Relations at the Independent Pharmacy Cooperative, Thomas Irby, pharmacist and owner of Irby Pharmacy in Vernonia, Oregon, Justin Ramsey, pharmacy director of La Clinica Medford, Randy Clem, owner and CEO of Managed Healthcare Pharmacy in Eugene, Lauren Lyles-Stolz, PharmD, Vice President of Reimbursement, Innovation, and Advocacy, the National Association of Chain Drugstores, Kevin Russell, Director of Ambulatory Pharmacy Services at St. Charles Health Systems in Bend, and Brian Mayo, Executive Director of the Oregon State Pharmacy Association. I do have some questions to get us going. Again, this panel will last 25 minutes, but Austin Blakely, you do have your hand raised. So I would like to kick off the panel, but do you have something urgent in advance of the kickoff?
No, I'm just eager to talk.
Okay, I anticipated that we would have lots of people that are ready to chat. So let's go ahead and get this panel going.
Chair Bailey, I apologize again for interrupting. Mr. Wade Arby, I'm not seeing your name on our registration list. Are you under a different name on this list?
It may be under Wade.
Sorry, what was that?
It may be under Wade Irby.
He's listed as Thomas Irby on the slide.
Yes, I see Wade.
All right, thank you.
Okay, well, thank you. Thank you for confirming that, Courtney. So as we get started here, pharmacies have made a number of recommendations to the board for us to consider. Some of the questions below that I'm going to share are just for us to help further understand the potential impact on pharmacies. So we recognize the importance of recommendations that are made to the board related to pharmacies, and we want to better understand these recommendations and how we might move forward. So the first question that we have here has been that pharmacies have made the suggestion that drug importation may be a potential solution for affordability issues. As a pharmacy provider, what would any of the pharmacy panelists here today have, what challenges would you see related to some of the suggestions of drug importation? For example, the Drug Supply Securities Act may create challenges. So I just would like to hear from pharmacies related to what drug importation may do or impact your pharmacies. John Cavello, I see you raise your hand. I'm going to give Mr. Blakesley the floor since he had his hand up at the beginning. So Mr. Blakesley, you do have the floor, but keep in mind, we have 25 minutes available for this panel.
Yes, indeed. I appreciate that. Thank you for the time, Chair Bailey and the PDAB board. I think where we import the drug from, where we purchase it from, has less impact than how we get reimbursed for the drug. I think where we purchase the drug from is relatively inconsequential as far as our provision of the care to patients in the pharmacy. The challenge that I see, the main challenge, again, is about reimbursement. Oregon already has the second lowest per capita pharmacy count in the nation, second only to the state of Alaska. And pharmacy access is a problem in Oregon. Nearly 40 pharmacies closed last year, and many pharmacies have closed year to date in Oregon as well. Pharmacies are hanging on by a thread. We can't afford to place any further financial burden on pharmacies. So my request is that as this process proceeds with the drug review process, that representatives from pharmacies are directly engaged to ensure that the implementation process does not have any financial harm to the pharmacies. We certainly want drugs to be affordable. And where they are procured from is less, whether it's internal or out. Where they're procured from is less, will have less impact on the pharmacy's operations than the reimbursement. So the impact to the pharmacy reimbursement must be examined closely after the plans and PBMs make any changes in response to this. So we will need to see what those changes are, and then we'll need to be able to have a response to how that will impact pharmacy and our ability to continue to serve Oregonians. And I'm happy to act as a subject matter expert on behalf of the 17 high school pharmacies that are in the state of Oregon. Thank you very much.
You're muted, Chair Bailey.
You don't want to hear my screaming child in the background. Mr. Mayo, I see that your hand is up next. You have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Chair Bailey. There would be problems with the importation if you're taking a look at the DSCSA issue. But I would say that, I continue to beat the drum regarding the UPL and making sure that pharmacies are not stuck with the cost of what the acquisition is and then what the UPL will be. I know that the model is not to get the pharmacies stuck with the extra delta that's there, but want to make sure that they're being protected as things move forward. There's other companies within the supply chain that are multi-billion-dollar companies, and we have the pharmacies that are barely hanging on for staying open. One of the things with this board, I think is important to take a look at is, we get the stories of people who have to choose between food, rents, or getting their medications. So the focus has to be the patient and what they're paying at the counter. And if you want to take a look at that, that means that the PBMs are the ones who are setting that cost and need to have a close look at PBM regulation here in Oregon. And if you put the focus of the Prescription Drug Affordability Board on the PBMs, you're going to solve the pricing problems, not only just for these 10 drugs, but for all drugs. Plus, if you eliminate the spread price, then you're going to have the insurers and the taxpayers also being able to save money. So with that, I appreciate you guys putting this together, and thank you for the time.
Thank you, Mr. Mayo. Mr. John Cavello, I believe you had your hand raised.
Yeah. Thank you, Chair Bailey. John Cavello, Senior Government Relations Director for the Independent Farmers Cooperative. in addition to being the largest buying group for independent pharmacies, we are also one of the largest secondary wholesalers in the country for independent pharmacy stores. Just to keep this focused on your question, Chair, because I'm sure there'll be other questions for us to answer on. We have no problem with states looking to pass drug importation laws, provided, I'm speaking as a wholesaler, they meet all the FDA requirements, and that includes compliance with the track and trace program of the DSCQA you referenced to, that there's a tracking legacy to this, and all the information is able to be collected to keep these compliant so that they are valid drugs for sale in this program. So far, only 2 states are really going down this road. So there's really no evidence yet to point to that these will provide lower cost drugs to pharmacies to acquire them at, patients for what it will cost them, and plan sponsors. But I think the issue of drug importation is dealing with the symptom, not the root cause of the problem, which I'm sure we'll get to later in this panel on how do you set the price and how do we get prices transparent to the point of what it costs to acquire and dispense a drug, and how's that relation to what it costs plan sponsors, and as a portion of that, what they set as patient cost share. That's really what you're trying to get at with this. So we don't oppose drug importation laws if they can meet those requirements, but as others have said, it is not the solution. It's just treating the symptom.
Thank you, Mr. Covello. Mr. Hubble, I want to recognize, I believe you had your hand raised next.
Thank you. Sorry, my video is having a little trouble today, but I got a big enough voice. I'm sure that'll take over. My name is Pat Hubble. I'm the owner of Brooklyn Pharmacy in Portland, Oregon. I wanted to address a couple of things. Number one, my concern is that, you know, the House Oversight Committee just released their key findings. One of the key findings is that the largest PBM forced drug manufacturers to pay rebates in exchange for the manufacturer's drug to be placed in a favorable tier on a PBM's formulary, making it difficult for competing lower priced prescriptions to get on their formulary. What we're seeing in our pharmacy and many pharmacies across the state and the nation is that PBMs are requiring the pharmacy to dispense a brand name product. When the copay is the same to the patient, it certainly puts the pharmacy in a very interesting predicament. That predicament is this. So the pharmacy is under contract with a PBM to get reimbursement rates different from brand name versus generic. So when a product goes to a generic pricing, to a brand name pricing, most brand names are below cost. So that is a major concern for us. A couple of myths, there's a couple of myths I want to dispel about pharmacies, independent pharmacies in general. Purchasing is critical. There's a lot of talk about that pharmacies aren't purchasing correctly. I can guarantee you we are the thriftiest people on planet Earth, all right? So purchasing is not an issue. I want to put that to rest. The other thing is that they say we should deny contracts. 80% of my population and most pharmacies across the state have 80% pharmacy populations. So if I deny a contract, for example, I have nobody to take care of, okay? Let's talk about contract negotiations. Contract negotiations are minimal at best. The top 3 absolutely denying any negotiation whatsoever. The other smaller groups will work with you, but it's still inadequate to maintain a positive pharmacy business model. I yield.
Mr. Hubble, thank you very much for sharing your comments related to pharmacies and UPLs. I believe the next individual with their hand raised was Caitlin Malone. Ms. Malone, you have the floor.
Oh, I apologize. It's Michael Murphy.
Oh, my apologies, Mr. Michael Murphy. You have the floor.
Right. Michael Murphy, I serve as the Senior Advisor at State-Owned Affairs for the American Pharmacists Association. Want to share that we appreciate and support the comments shared by Brian Mayo at the Oregon State Pharmacy Association. But similar to what John Covello was sharing, the drug importation programs, I'm not sure if that is the solution to this current problem that you all are looking to decrease the cost of medications for patients. As John said, we haven't seen that translate in other states to lower cost medications for patients, but we have seen increased risk of patient safety concerns for patients through the introduction of drug importation programs. we see an increased risk of opportunities for mix-ups, mishandling, mislabeling, and other rogue activity that would place patients in our vulnerable communities at higher risk. So wanted to make sure to highlight some of the concerns around drug importation programs and that they may not necessarily be a solution to the problem that we're looking to fix during this conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. And Ms. Malone, you had your hand raised?
Yeah, hi, Katie Malone with Albertsons Company. So just wanted to kind of echo those comments by Michael and John in terms of drug importation not necessarily being a solution, but also continue to highlight the concern that I would have from a DSCSA standpoint, not only from a regulatory perspective and ensuring that the products that we are getting are in fact compliant, but also operationally at the pharmacy level, when you're looking at entities that operate, within the state of Oregon and others. So I think that offers some particular complications from an operational standpoint. And then also just kind of going back to some of the comments from earlier in the discussion about importation and the fact that, if this is implemented in one state, it doesn't necessarily mean that, pharmacy is contained in that state. So I would worry about, regulatory challenges and differences from state to state, especially those that border Oregon. And so those are some of the concerns that I would raise with the drug importation comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Russell, you have the floor.
Unmute. I think if we want to help reduce cost to patients quickly, which is what I'm hearing from our advocates and others, and then I think that importation is counterproductive to the conversation. I think that the logistics of reimportation program would take years to manifest itself and be able to be implemented. And I think it would come at great cost. I think it would become at great cost to the state of Oregon and administratively to all the people involved in the supply chain to try to adjust to a new model. And I think those are resources and time that could be better spent addressing the affordability of the patients directly through other means. So.
Well, thank you. So with our about, 10 or 11 minutes remaining, what I'd like to propose to everyone here today then is kind of given, we've covered some of the potential impacts of importation, but as it relates to UPL, we have heard from pharmacies in some of the listening sessions that there's concerns over, could a pharmacy purchase at the UPL and things. So what suggestions do panelists here today have for the board to consider related to specifically the UPL model, and how would you propose that as we look at this to ensure that both patients and providers are protected should a UPL model be implemented? And it does look like Dr. Lauren Lyle-Stoltz, I'm not sure if it was related to that question, but I see your hand raised, so you have the floor.
Thanks, Chair Bailey. Yes, it's in response to your second question. Lauren Lyle-Stoltz with the Chain Drug Store Association, pharmacist by training, former regulator in Washington State. UPL has been something I've been diving into for the past 2 years or so on the state level, but I have been highly engaged with the Inflation Reduction Act that we're seeing being implemented at the federal level. And so when you ask, what should you be tracking and looking at to see where those conversations are going, I would highly encourage the board to take a look at what's happening at the federal level with the IRA and how that's going to intersect with what you're trying to do in the state. We actually had a conversation with CMS this morning about how this MFP refund, or in this case, the UPL, how that would be effectuated, because the way the pharmacy models work, as many others have described, is a retrospective model. The pharmacy does not buy the drug at a UPL, or at the federal level, we do not buy the drug, or we're not advocating to buy the drug at the new maximum fair price that they're proposing, which I would say is almost synonymous to the UPL. And so the pharmacy would be responsible. Well, the goal would be for the pharmacy to get reimbursed fully by the payer or by the PBM. And so what we've seen in other states, as was mentioned earlier, is that there's language on the retrospective side, not the prospective side as being proposed in the UPL approach here in Oregon, is that, you know, the PBM cannot reimburse the pharmacy more than the UPL, but there's no guardrail for how as far as how low the PBM could reimburse the pharmacy. And so some of the things that we've been advocating on from the NACDS perspective is how do we set up those guardrails that in fact ensure, to Corey Greenblatt's point, that we're creating a sustainable environment for the pharmacy to continue to offer those drugs to the patient. So we want to ensure that the PBM isn't reimbursing the pharmacy also below the UPL, if that is synonymous to the ingredient costs, as well as ensuring that there is some attached dispensing fee with that service. Those are the same arguments we're making at the federal level with the IRA. And we're also advocating that it's not a prospective model where you're buying the drugs at this discounted price, because that means you have to create a separate inventory at the pharmacy to track these drugs if only certain patients can have access to a UPL drug. And I'm not sure if the idea that all Oregonians would have, you know, be eligible for these UPL drugs, and how will the pharmacy know? So there are a lot of things that we need to think through. And I really resonated with Justin Weiss's points on the second panel, is just continue to have these conversations and dialogue about how this will impact everyone in the supply chain. But those are some of the main concerns that we've raised. We've raised it in other states. But I think it goes without saying that I think we're all on this call and we're supportive of prescription drug affordability for the patients, but we also want to make sure that we can keep the doors open, right, to provide that access. So I'll stop there, and I'm happy to answer any follow-up questions, Chair Bailey, and turn it over to my colleagues.
Thank you. So with our about 6 minutes left, Mr. Robert Judge, do you have a follow-up question, or did you want me to proceed with the other hands that are raised?
Chair Bailey, I have a follow-up question.
You have the floor.
So, we're all, the PDEB exists to try to come up with recommendations on how to address the affordability of drugs. That is it's a burden to everybody, and I don't think there's anybody who disagree with that. So we're hearing a lot today from individuals saying, how do we protect me, or how do we do this? What I'd like to hear are, what are your recommendations for affordability? What would you recommend to the board to consider as we think about upper payment limits and affordability? Do any of you have, Dr. Lyles, if you have a recommendation based upon, because I think you had a very cogent point that you're making there.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would start with saying, let's watch what's happening at the IRA level. I mean, I know some of the comments made earlier from the advocacy community, and I don't want to diminish. I think it was the last point about, let's get it done now. But I think affordability is very important, but we're seeing a lot of holes in the system as we're trying to figure this out at the federal level. So I think, one, that's something to monitor, get those lessons learned. I mean, final guidance should be coming out really soon on this negotiation, the negotiation program. So that may be another framework and resource to use, and then bring that conversation back to the stakeholder group as you're pursuing your feasibility study. And then as far as, I don't know if this is going to get the answer to the affordability, but I will say on the pharmacy side, just make sure that there are guardrails in place, because you need affordability and sustainability if you're going to do this program, to the points made earlier. And I think in the feasibility study, maybe you can identify, right, where are there holes? And I think Brian spoke to it earlier. If you're addressing spread pricing, if you're doing all these other reforms in the system, savings should be coming out somewhere, right, to help lower that cost. I mean, and you can look at the Washington State 3-axis study that came out in June. You can look at the FTC interim report that just came out 2 weeks ago, and then the report that came out yesterday from the oversight hearing. Those are all really good guideposts, I think, for the board to take a look at, to see, okay, this is where there's excess in the system. this can help, how do we reform those areas to ensure affordability, and how does that work in the PDAP? And I think we just continue to have these conversations. So I don't have, the master plan here, but I would say those are some of the areas where we're looking to and hoping that will inform your PDAP decision-making.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So with our about 4 minutes that we have here remaining, it looked like Ms. Maxwell had her hand up next. I wanted to acknowledge her comments. Ms. Maxwell, you have the floor.
Thank you, Chairman Bailey. I appreciate that. Melanie Maxwell, president of Align RX. We are the largest independently owned PSAO in the country, and we represent a significant number of Oregon pharmacies. One of the components that I want to ensure that you guys consider as you're walking down this challenge with implementing a UPL is looking at the current environment of how reimbursement contracts are constructed and the reimbursement tools that are part of those contracts. Most specifically, several of the contracts that impact Oregon pharmacies are related to what they call an effective rate contract. And under an effective rate contract, it essentially allows the payer side, the PBM side, to have variable reimbursement. So in a traditional contract, for example, brand drugs would be reimbursed at AWP minus X%. But under an effective rate contract, PBMs have the ability to pay multiple variables of AWP discounts, AWP minus 18, one time minus 25, another time minus 30, another time. So the reimbursement is already all over the place to get back to an aggregate effective rate under the contract. And when you're implementing a UPL, you really do need to understand how the price point that you select would impact those types of contracts. They're not, there are probably more claims in Oregon that are subject to an effective rate contract than not at this point. So that's going to have a significant impact to reimbursement to a pharmacy. It is absolutely important to know that pharmacies cannot simply buy the drug and get reimbursed for that drug at the same price point. There are costs associated with dispensing that have to be considered. And so when you're talking about only focusing on the ingredient cost piece of reimbursement, you're not considering the full picture of what it takes a provider. And this is not unique to just the pharmacy world. Physician providers, hospital providers, infusion providers, we're all faced with the same challenge in that there is a cost associated with providing and dispensing or administering that drug product that oftentimes are not considered appropriate enough to set the right professional fee to go along with that drug cost component. So I just encourage this committee to really look closely at intended consequence of UPL, look historically at how well price setting has worked. I've not yet found one example of where price setting led to the intended outcome. I think it's a great idea to try to address affordability, but to really do that effectively, you have to understand the entire supply chain and who sets the price point at each portion of that supply chain to know where you will be able to impact cost at the greatest level. I understand the manufacturer has a perspective here, but quite honestly, that is a key point. And the congressional hearing yesterday, that was pointed out quite heavily, that to really address what's going on with drug pricing, you have to understand the manufacturer's perspective and why they set list prices the way they do.
And Ms. Maxwell, we only have about 30 seconds remaining. Thank you very much for all this informative information. Mr. Cavallo, we've got a few seconds remaining.
Real fast, to get to your point on the questions. As I suggested in past meeting, you should look to require in all commercial places in Oregon, the adoption of Medicaid's program in Oregon of the actual acquisition cost, which is Oregon specific, plus the dispensing fee and including all transaction fees. I'm glad the issue of PBM GPOs came up. You need to ensure all concessions from manufacturers to any entity that sets the reimbursement rate is passed through to the patient. And the other thing I would urge you to do is look to utilize fully, if Oregon has it operationally, the all claims database to understand what's paid and what's being charged, because that affects plan design, which is the heart of what you're getting at is patient cost share. All of these areas will reduce patient cost setting. That will make it more affordable to them if them and their employers and plan sponsors know they're really only paying what for our members it costs to acquire and dispense the drug. So I appreciate you giving me those specific examples.
All right. Well, thank you, Mr. Cavallo. I do appreciate it. So before we move on to our next panel, I do need to make a motion that we extend this meeting by an additional 15 minutes because we do have one more panel group participating, and somewhere along the line, I didn't manage time as well. So I would like to see if one of my colleagues will make a motion, or perhaps I can make a motion myself to extend the meeting by 15 minutes to commence at 12:15 Pacific. So will my colleagues second, or Mr. Judge, you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I don't have a second. I just have a hard stop at noon.
Okay, I appreciate that. I don't believe we have to have quorum to finish this. You can listen to the, oh, Dr. Burns.
I also have a hard stop at noon.
Okay, well, we don't have a vote related to this, so I would still like to make a motion to extend it by 15 minutes. Since these are recorded, my colleagues will be able to listen to the remaining 15 minutes at a more convenient time. Do I have a second to Dan Kennedy? Your hand is raised.
I will second that extension motion.
Thank you.
Chair Bailey, may I get a quick consult from council that quorum will not be necessary to continue the meeting? Because I do believe that if folks do have to leave at noon and we are down to 3, I want to make sure comfort with them that it will be okay for.
Please ask council before we proceed.
And Pramila or Jake, if you are available.
While we are waiting to hear from council, I am going to advance us forward. So our next panel are health systems, FQHCs, and providers. Other things equal, this panel will last 25 minutes. The attendees, please turn on your cameras and microphones. We have Robert Trachenberg, Senior Director of Health Center Operations at Cascadia Health. We have Arsala Shah, Senior Director of Pharmacy at Central City Concern Portland. We have Simon Vismontis, Council Government Relations at Kaiser. Jay Flesh, Clinical Pharmacist, Lapine Community Health. Amanda Cummings, PharmD, Director of Pharmacy at Dietitians and Cancer Services of Adventist. Michelle Coder, Pharmacy Director, Multnomah County Health Department. Shingta Imanash, Nara Northwest Native American Rehabilitation Association. Jennifer McElvery, Director of Pharmacy, Neighborhood Health Center, Seattle. Lisa Sandoval, PharmD, BCACP, One Community Health Hood River. Marty Carty, Government Affairs Director, Oregon Primary Care Association. Joe Evans, Peace Health at Riverbend Hospital, Springfield. Amy Servan, Senior Director of Pharmacy, Rogue Community Health Center, Medford. Corey Ron, Director of Pharmacy, Salem Health Hospital and Clinics. Megan Jones, PharmD, BCGP, Director of Outpatient Pharmacy, Samaritan Health Services, Corvallis. April Etheridge Bosworth, Virginia Garcia Memorial Health Center, Hillsborough, and Russ Heaton, VP of Pharmacy, Yakima Valley Farm Workers Clinic. Do we have direction from council before we proceed?
Not yet, Chair Bailey, still working on that. Thank you.
Okay, so we will move forward with some of our questions of these stakeholders, and I will interrupt once we get feedback from council related to extending the session to 12:15 Pacific. So for everyone here today, what specific protections or structure?
Apologies, Chair Bailey. Can I get just a hands up from folks that will need to depart at 12 noon? I want to affirmatively tell council how many people we will have remaining. I see. So Robert and Amy would need to depart. So we would have Chair Bailey, Robert You have
it
to
would
leave.
be-
I'm sorry. Chair Bailey, Dan Kennedy,
And possibly Dan Hartong.
and
But
possibly
I
Dan.
think for the interest of the stress of this, I do apologize to the constituents of this, but we may have to wrap up by noon. So just please keep your answers brief and to the point of the question.
Okay, thank you. So related to specific protections and structure, what would be required for health systems or hospitals to share details regarding exactly any 340B program savings that are used to benefit patients? So are there statutory protections, regulation, or contractual related to anything that we may propose related to UPLs and the potential impact on hospitals and FQHC providers? Marty, your hand is raised. You have the floor.
I think I'm going to ask for some clarification on your question. Are you asking us to respond to, are there contractual reasons or obligations that would interfere with UPLs?
Yeah, if that would be the question. And then are there suggestions related to the work that we're doing related to a UPL, and any suggestions that 340B covered entities may make to help us through our process?
I'll defer to my FQHC colleagues around contracts. I don't have a window into that. Do others have comments? Okay. From the FQHC perspective, I think I can offer. I'm not aware of any contractual issues that an upper payment limit would cause related to an FQHC's contract relationship with a payer or a PBM or a manufacturer. However, recognizing that, I think our greater concern is that upper payment limits, as a previous speaker pointed out, one, have an impact then on the pharmacy's ability to do business, and recognizing in managed care in Oregon, dispensing fees are less than $1 per prescription. And so upper payment limits just further make it difficult for patients or pharmacies to serve patients. I think I would call out a recent survey completed and recommended change to dispensing fees done by the Health Authority that came out last week. And note that based on survey results, dispensing fees are recommended in fee-for-service averaged at a little over $20. So you can see there's a big discrepancy between what managed care or payers pay for a dispensing fee versus what the actual cost to dispense a medication is. I think that's one. So when we decrease how much a reimbursement or the margin that an organization might make, we're just further hamstringing their ability to serve patients, expand programs, and so on and so forth. For the 340B covered entity specifically, I think it's really important to recognize that Congress, in its wisdom, decades ago, created the 340B program specifically to stretch scarce federal resources. They recognized they could not afford to pay for the healthcare delivery system with taxpayer dollars and ensure that everyone had access to medications, regardless of their ability to pay or where they were born. And so in their wisdom, they set up this program. When states start tinkering with a program around the edges that Congress intended to benefit the safety net in any way, you will have an adverse impact to the safety net. Namely, patients will lose access to healthcare services, prescription drugs will be less available and affordable, particularly for uninsured patients, where 340B dollars directly are reinvested into ensuring access to prescription drugs for those who have no insurance. And so I would recommend that this board explicitly consider excluding or carving out 340B covered entities, namely FQHCs, from my perspective, from any upper payment limits impact, because it's just not workable given the overlay of the federal program and how it works and was designed to work for federally qualified health centers and other covered entities. Our healthcare system is broken. The way that prescription drugs are managed across the different, from the manufacturer to the PBM to the pharmacy, from the payer, it's all broken. I think we can all acknowledge that. Implementing upper payment limits for covered entities like FQHCs will fundamentally change access to healthcare in Oregon. It will not make prescription drugs for the most vulnerable Oregonians more available or more affordable. It will have the exact opposite impact.
Well, Marty, thank you for sharing this. And I do want to reinforce this group has been very helpful with your time during our listening sessions and through the process too. So my apologies that without direction from council, we do have to cut this short.
And Chair Bailey, if I may interrupt, I've just received word from council. We are good to continue. And for anyone that does need to depart, understand and appreciate, and the full recording will be available. So please do continue. And we're grateful for panel folks for hanging with us. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you for everyone for being flexible. Robert Judge, I know you have to leave. So Robert, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks, Chair Bailey, and I'll make this quick. But Mr. Cardy, thank you for your comments. I've been a longtime fan of the 340B program and the value that it provides to underserved populations and the role that OPCA plays in Oregon is vital. But I want to be clear about something. So upper payment limit is a reimbursement on a drug, and 340B is an acquisition cost method for a drug. And so the point that you're making, just so I'm clear, is if an upper payment limit may produce less margin, which is used to fund your underserved responsibilities. Is that the point that you're arguing for exclusions of 340B entities?
That is
and
precisely.
Would that apply to hospitals as well? Where we have
that is
issues making huge monies on, drug, cancer medication, infusion centers and stuff like that?
Thanks for the question, Mr. Judge. So yeah, that is precisely the point I'm making, is that right now, FQHCs specifically are required through both federal statute and HRSA rule to reinvest and be able to demonstrate through reporting how those dollars are reinvested into patients. And so any impact to between the acquisition cost and the reimbursement, even though one might say, I've seen Ms. Horvath point out that FQHCs would still receive a margin. While that's true, if the margin is less, that means there is less money in the safety net system to improve access to healthcare for Oregonians, particularly the most vulnerable. I can't speak on behalf of hospitals. I see Mr. Evans has his hand up.
Yeah, I can speak to how that may impact us.
Mr. Evans, one moment before you go, because Vice Chair Burns has to leave right at noon, I wanted to make sure she had any opportunity to ask a question before she left. Vice Chair Burns, do you have any questions before you leave?
I do not, and I can stay until 12:05, and then I'm gonna have to hop off.
Okay,
Sorry.
I just wanted to give you the opportunity. Mr. Evans, I apologize for interrupting, but you now have the floor. Thank you.
Yes, we would be very similar to kind of what was mentioned there. So a big portion of how we kind of manage some of our more vulnerable patients, and here in Eugene, I think of our mental health patients in our BHU unit, is those margins that come through that 340B program, including some of that reimbursement that does get reinvested into the patient care that we do into the community. So there is an impact to those margins changing and how we can care when we're talking about an infusion center where we have a specific reimbursement that tends to be a little more favorable versus behavioral health unit where there's more of a challenge of the expense of the care outside of drug costs. We don't have huge drug costs at that BHU, but we do have specialists, pharmacists, nursing providers that we have to supplement for some of those reimbursements we get elsewhere.
Thank you for that. And thank you, Mr. Cardy.
And so are there any, suggested protections or any type of suggestions or feedback that stakeholders here today can provide to the board related to kind of helping make sure that we're avoiding any unanticipated consequences of our UPL discussions. Ms. McElvery, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you, Chair, members of the board. I'm Jennifer McElravy, and I'm the Director of Pharmacy at Neighborhood Health Center. And we're a federally qualified health center that serves about 20,000 patients in the Portland metro area. And I'm concerned that in the proposed approach for the UPL, 340B covered entities or contract pharmacies would not be able to be reimbursed more than the UPL price. So we depend on every cent of our 340B savings, just to echo what Marty said, which is the margin between the reimbursement we receive from our insurance payers and the 340B cost for filling prescriptions. So these savings cover the high operational costs of running our in-house pharmacy. And my concern with the proposed model for the UPL is the potential negative impact on our margin and our 340B savings. So our in-house pharmacy, we have a 340B prescription assistance program that helps us to stretch the resources that Marty talked about to serve as many patients of the health center as possible. So our pharmacy ensures affordable access to prescriptions for our low-income patients through sliding fee scale discounts. So we pass along the acquisition cost plus a nominal dispensing fee to our patients. We fill about 38% of our prescriptions on a sliding fee scale. So our patients depend on our pharmacy for our medications. So we have a MedSync program. We proactively remind our patients to refill their medications. We've set up our pharmacy workflow to fill most of our patients' chronic meds the same time of the month. And we also have a prescription delivery service, which is supported by these savings. So as far as your question, what are some suggestions? So I encourage you to please consider, like what Marty said, to echo that, consider excluding drugs purchased through the 340B program from this UPL model so that we can continue to have the savings from the program to provide care to our most vulnerable patients. Thank you so much.
Thank you for sharing that perspective. Ms. Michelle Coder, you now have the floor.
Thank you, Chair Bailey and committee members. Michelle Coder, Multnomah County Health Department. Multnomah County has operates a federally qualified health center in the Portland metro area. We serve over 50,000 patients a year. And I'm not going to reiterate what Jennifer and Marty so eloquently said, but also highlight some of the ways that we use 340B savings in our organization, which is largely increasingly becoming increasing access to medical care. So that is hiring and covering the personnel costs for non-physician providers, since we have significant challenges with access for our patient population. Historically, we've also covered laboratory services, so the costs of operating our laboratory program within our health centers, including funding for clients who otherwise would not be able to afford both laboratory tests and medications. And I think the impact of UPLs is not limited to those drugs that would be designated for a UPL. It's really helping to cover access to other medications that we normally provide to our population, including uninsured and underinsured. And so what I'm speaking to or referencing is approximately 80% of the prescription drugs that we fill are generic medications. We are very good stewards of the 340B savings that we have. And increasingly, our reimbursement for those medications is decreasing and not covering even the drug costs. So we're not just talking about an impact to access to medications that would be subject to a UPL, but access to medications at large.
Thank you for sharing. Mr. Ron, you have the floor.
Hi, Corey Rand, Chief Pharmacy Officer at Salem Health. I wanted to give you a specific example of how we're using 340B savings. In our organization, we use those margins to fund a pharmacist-led diabetes clinic where we have pharmacists that are managing patients with diabetes. We have shown and proven that pharmacists do a better job of doing that than their primary care providers, and we use 340B dollars to pay for those pharmacists to have that clinic open. If those margins were to decrease, our ability to serve that patient population in Marion and Polk County would go down quite substantially. And so the idea of an upward payment limit affecting our ability to use those 340B dollars to really focus in on those disease states that have a big impact on population health, and we'd be hampered by that. So I like the idea of trying to lower prescription drug costs. I don't know if an upper payment limit on every aspect of that supply chain would be the best way to go about doing that.
Thank you for sharing. Mr. Cardy, your hand was raised next, I believe.
Yeah, thanks. Another point I think that's really important for folks to recognize here is, and remember, the 340B savings, those dollars that folks are talking about reinvesting into people, stretching scarce resources, those aren't taxpayer dollars, right? This is money that, these are dollars that if health centers, FQHCs, and other covered entities don't have access to, someone has to supplant that somewhere. Otherwise, people lose access to healthcare and prescription medications. So is that the state of Oregon that's going to come up with the difference to make sure these organizations like Salem Health, like the FQHCs on this call, are able to continue current service level? I think it's really important to recognize, again, I just want to point out, these are not taxpayer dollars, and that was by design in Congress. So we're cost shifting access to healthcare from manufacturers and the PBMs who have their bottom lines are solid to the state of Oregon if we impact 340B programs.
Thank you for sharing, Mr. Cardy. Ms. April Etheridge Bosworth, and I believe after this comment, we will try to move forward with the agenda. But Ms. Etheridge Bosworth, you have the floor.
Good morning. Thank you all for allowing us some time to speak today. I just want to echo everything my peers have said. I'm currently serving as Director of Pharmacy at Virginia Garcia Memorial Health Center. We serve about 50,000 patients in Washington and Yamhill counties. Many of our savings are crucial to some services that, as many of my peers outlined, aren't otherwise able to cover expenses for those services. These services include our clinical pharmacy services. As Corey mentioned, our clinical pharmacy services not only help manage critical disease states, but also help increase access by allowing us to see those patients that have those disease states, such as diabetes, hypertension, freeing up the providers to provide additional access to our underserved and uninsured. In addition, we also use those savings to provide youth development programs, specifically at our school-based health centers, our migrant and seasonal farm worker outreach programs. We're currently in what we call migrant camp season, where we go and serve those patients that are working in the fields and in the nurseries. And then another example of ways we use our savings that are critical is through our women's clinic programs and reproductive programs. Without these dollars, some of these programs would really be in jeopardy.
Thank you for sharing information about those programs. And Mr. Heaton, forgive me, I did not see your hand raised previously, but I see it now. Mr. Heaton, you have the floor.
Thank you, and I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you guys. I'm with Yakima Valley Farm Workers. We serve around 200,000 patients throughout Oregon and Washington, a little over 50,000 in Oregon. And as Marty indicated, we're a strong proponent of pulling the FQHCs out of this. We are safety net providers. We, as Oregon is already a pharmacy desert, I believe it would become a primary care desert as well if you lost the safety net providers that can provide services really only through the 340B savings. We would be at a huge loss at this organization if we didn't have the 340B savings. We couldn't do nursing visits, dietitians, clinical pharmacists like the others have alluded to, and provide those sliding scale for medications for our uninsured or underinsured patients. So I really think that we should be looking and targeting more of the PBMs, some of the practices that the PBMs are doing, the pharmaceutical companies and the insurers. Squeezing the pharmacies is not going to be the option here. Oregon already lost 36 pharmacies last year. Washington lost over 60 pharmacies last year and over 80 over the last 18 months. So I really think that protecting the 340B savings is crucial, and really looking at making sure that the pharmacies can be able to be sustainable.
Thank you. So with our last couple remaining minutes here, I saw that Amy raised her hand. So Ms. Amy Servan, you have the floor.
Hi, thank you for this opportunity to speak. I am Amy Servan. I'm a Senior Director of Pharmacy in Southern Oregon at Rogue Community Health. We're an FQHC. I don't have any answers on, I think, how to actually put protections in place other than to try to remove covered entities out of this. I would like to also just kind of caution the board in looking forward of unintended consequences when we're talking about, I think it's been brought before, the IRA being put in place to help with like lowering insulin costs for, for patients across the US, but it had unintended consequences, I think, to some of our programs where we were getting very reduced acquisition costs on a lot of insulins. And I was able to give patients that were uninsured insulin for $4 or $5 because of our acquisition costs and getting that out to more and more patients. And as an unintended consequence, our acquisition costs have now significantly increased on, the insulins and some of the other medications that are up and coming in the next couple of years, which means we may not be able to supply a lot of those life-saving medications to as many patients across the board. So while we're considering these upper payment limits on certain medications and stuff, I'm not sure that it would have an effect, but I think there just needs to be an eye out based on what we're seeing with the IRA for FQHCs, covered entities in the 340B program. What could potential unintended consequences be of this type of program for our covered entities and our patients?
Thank you for sharing this example. And since we are here at time, but I do see the hand raised, Mr. Flush, you will have the final remarks related to this panel. So if you could, you now have the floor.
Thank you very much. I work at Lapine Community Health Center as a clinical pharmacist. I would just bring up a very few brief comments for the board to consider. One thing with drug manufacturers and PBMs, they have a very high profit margin. Compare the auto industry as an example. The typical auto manufacturer averages a 7.5% on the vehicle, and that still is healthy for them. They are making more cars, they're expanding. Compare that to a particular company, let's say Novo Nordisk, who the cost of manufacturing for Ozempic may be less than $5, and the sale price of that is around the $1,000 price tag per month supply. PBMs also, when I hear the talk that they are looking to drive down prices for pharmaceuticals and save the patient money, well, PBMs, looking at their profit margin on their statements, is well above the profit margin for many other industries. Also thinking about the fact that pharmaceutical companies often receive a lot of taxpayer funding through the National Institutes of Health supplying lots of grant money to research at universities, where then the pharmaceutical manufacturers benefit from that, and that's using taxpayer money. After the fact, then the taxpayer has to pay twice because they pay for greatly inflated prices on medications. One of the arguments is that with drug manufacturers is that it costs us so much money to get these products to market. Well, I have a desk literally full of pamphlets and fancy brochures from drug representatives advertising their product. That advertising on TV and with the pamphlets that I get is very expensive. And so that's something that I please wish the board would consider about where these prices come from. A lot of these prices are generated where they do not need to be. So that would be my statement on that. I please would implore the board to look at why the profit margins are so high, especially when taxpayer money has been involved. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.
I appreciate it. Thank you to all that have participated here today. I do want to announce that our next meeting is on August 21st, 2024 at 9:30 a.m. I would like to briefly ask staff if we have any announcements.
Chair Bailey, no announcements, but gratitude to everyone who participated today, and particularly to the folks that hang on the latter panels, and great discussion. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. Thank you. This next portion of our agenda is for general public comments that were submitted or requested in advance. The board received 6 written comments, which are posted on our website. Written comments are reviewed by the board prior to the meeting, and we received public written comments from the following individuals and organizations. Bridget Walsh from Boehringer Ingelheim Pharmaceuticals, Blisine Pinkowski from Johnson & Johnson, Carrie Harder and Harmeet Dillon from GSK, Daria McGrew and Merlin Brittenham from Pharma, Greg Baker from Affirmed RX, he sent 2 letters, and from Lisa Kreider from Bend related to Eliquis. So those were the public comments we received for written testimony, and we had no one sign up for public oral testimony. So because of that, I'm now going to advance us to mentioning that with there being no further business before the board, we need a motion and a second to adjourn the meeting. All in favor of adjourning the meeting, please say yes.
Yes.
Yes. Anyone opposed, please say no. All right, with that mentioned, the meeting is now adjourned, keeping in mind that our next meeting is on August 21st at 9:30 a.m. Thank you to everyone here today.